Many questions hover over the production history of the Animorphs television program. Behind-the-scenes information went largely unpresented to the general public, which makes sense. The series hardly set general audiences on fire. It wasn't a huge deal then, and it hasn't gained any kind of cult following since, so there's been no market for a nostalgic DVD box set or anything. The only official behind-the-scenes product for the series was a book called Meet the Stars of Animorphs, which was mostly focused on mini-bios of the principal cast. As such, there's only so much in this video that can be considered official information. There's going to be a fair amount of conclusions made based on the faintest of clues, which really shouldn't be considered official. If I come across any new information that counters anything I say in this video, I'll make an additional one correcting myself. To understand where Animorphs fits into the history of Nickelodeon, we have to, well, examine the history of Nickelodeon. While Nickelodeon really came into its own in the early 90s, the cable station has officially been around since the late 70s. It unofficially began in 1977 as a demo station for an experimental cable system for Columbus, Ohio called Cube, which allowed for viewers to interact with live television programs, answer station polls, things like that. This technology would eventually evolve into things like the Home Shopping Network and pay-per-view. While Cube was a critical success, it simply wasn't profitable, and was shut down some years later. One of the original stations created for this system was called Pinwheel, named after its primary program, which we'll get back to. In 1979, Pinwheel tried its luck as a proper cable station, changing its name to Nickelodeon, and started airing on Warner cable systems. Nobody watched it. It ranked dead last in ratings, and the station started systematically pruning out its lowest-rated shows, which were usually PBS-style documentary shows like Against the Odds and Going Great. Going Great. Not even Keanu Reeves could save that show.
What do your friends think about you collecting bears?
Look at this fairy, so soft and cute.
Oh, let's see.
He's cute.
Oh, she's so cute. Look at that. Bear Jane! I've been looking all over for you. We gotta go down to the Bears Only Cafe and talk bearsness. Listen, you know that Bears Necessity contest? We've got problems. So listen, we'll go down, we'll talk business, and hey, everything will be okay. I love this guy.
The majority of Nickelodeon's programming during the 80s were shows exported from Britain, Canada, and Japan. Very few original shows were produced. They simply couldn't afford to. Even their flagship program, Pinwheel, was pretty cheap. I know it's got its hardcore fans, and I certainly don't dislike the show. But let's face it, it was a pretty blatant Sesame Street ripoff. It followed the same formula of puppets and humans interacting in an enclosed environment, singing songs and learning lessons. There was an Oscar the Grouch clone, there were Bert and Ernie clones, and over 50% of the show were foreign-produced shorts, which saved on costs. In short, Nickelodeon was only treading water during the first half of the 80s, largely by being so thrift. Only then did they figure out how to dog paddle, mostly in part due to the changing of leadership from Cy Schneider to Geraldine Laybourne, and Viacom buying Nickelodeon from Warner Brothers. First off, they started airing commercials. I know, that seems like a square one kind of thing, but it wasn't that uncommon to see commercialless stations in the early 80s, and Nickelodeon was competing with PBS and the premium cable Disney Channel, neither of which had commercials. This was risky, of course, to get your regular audience used to a commercialless environment for so many years to suddenly bring them in, but it was necessary if the channel was going to start turning a profit. And with that, Nickelodeon needed to change their image more than ever. While critically successful with adults, the channel had gained something of a reputation as a green vegetable channel, something that was good for kids, but not exactly fun. First off, the Nickelodeon pinball had to go, as it was one of the least compelling station logos in history. So they turned to Fred Siebert and Alan Goodman, who were in charge of making the station IDs for MTV, the big success of 80s cable, and also owned by Viacom. It was those two who came up with the idea of Nickelodeon's iconic Splat logo, inspired by one of the station's on-load shows called You Can't Do That on Television. The messy but not scatological tone put the station on the right tracks, and saw the success of their breakout game show Double Dare. But it wasn't until the early 90s before they started seriously producing original content, and even then, they were very slow and methodical about it. We all know about the original Nicktoons, Ren and Stimpy, Rugrats, and Doug. What you may not know is that the station went through a serious, years-long screening process in which 8 different animated pilots were developed and gradually weeded through to pick the best ones. These shows also came in at exactly the right time, as most animated shows in this period were brain-dead 30-minute toy commercials, which left a vacuum of quality for animated products, which these shows filled. Another successful money-saving trick was to produce a lot of game shows and film them all at Nickelodeon Studios, which seconded as a tourist attraction at Universal Studios Florida. And Nickelodeon Studios only really happened because Laybourne was owed a few political favors by Summer Redstone, whom Laybourne helped make primary shareholder of Viacom in 1987. What's my point in all this history? To show that, despite their ultimate success as a television station based around snot, Nickelodeon tends to be rather cautious when it comes to production. They basically baby-stepped their way to success, and only took gradual, calculated risks in terms of their programming. That's what makes them picking up the Animorphs series seem so odd at first. Even in the second half of the 90s, when Nickelodeon was really banking, the sheer magnitude of the special effects alone would make such a series a daunting task. 5 reoccurring alien species, numerous one-shot aliens, several kinds of alien ships, morphing, the Yeerk pool, all the Elmas stuff. To have all that in there would make it the biggest production Nickelodeon ever dealt with. Plus, Animorphs is notably violent, which didn't fit into Nickelodeon's MO at all. Think about it. Can you name a single series on Nick prior to Animorphs that you could clearly classify in the action genre? There really isn't any. The closest thing I can think of was that water balloon episode of Salute Your Shorts. It's not like action was uncommon on other channels, this being the world of Power Rangers, Pokemon, and Batman. Nickelodeon simply avoided that kind of material on purpose. So why go forward with it if it seems so big for Nickelodeon's britches? Well, there's probably 2 reasons behind it. First off, despite being more special effects heavy and more violent than any of their previous shows, Animorphs actually fit nicely thematically with many of the live-action shows they were airing at the time. The Secret World of Alex Max and The Journey of Alan Strange were both science fiction programs about preteens and early teenagers getting caught in a diabolical plot and having to use powers to deal with it while keeping their identities secret. Those series, as well as the Mystery Files of Shelby Woo and Space Cases, all dealt with young people rising to take on serious challenges. All this contributed to a kids versus adult theme that Nickelodeon had been riding on for years. And hey, the Animorphs themselves have gender and racial diversity, which is also something Nickelodeon was actively promoting. At just a glance, it would seem that Animorphs would fit in perfectly.
It was easier. That was also the end of a cycle of live action stuff, because Nickelodeon, you probably remember, used to have Are You Afraid of the Dark, used to have a bunch of great live action stuff, and I think Animorphs was the tail end of that, because then they went into all this reality crap where it's game shows and animation that they produce cheaply in Korean sweatshops and stuff like that, and so they don't spend the money anymore. They're trying, I think, now to come back a bit with some live action, but it's, from what I've seen of the shows they've done, it's far cry from the glory days.
The other reason was the success of the Goosebumps television series on Fox. Goosebumps was partially the work of Scholastic Productions, who had been working to put their popular series on television for a while now. Before Goosebumps, they did work on shows for the Babysitters Club and Clifford, so they already had a production team in place that Nickelodeon could use. And since Goosebumps and Animorphs were competing as the #1 Scholastic's book series, it made sense to get the other one on the small screen too. If Goosebumps could be successful, there's no reason Animorphs couldn't be. So yeah, you got a book series whose story already fits in with your young adult lineup, and a production team who's already been successful adapting their own products. It's hard to say what Nickelodeon execs were really thinking at the time, but this is probably going to be really successful, let's just coast on this, is a fairly good bet. As such, Nickelodeon itself had very little to do with the series beyond marketing, and the bulk of the work was given to Scholastic Productions. And thus, Animorphs went into production, and they bit off more than they could chew.